Do you want me to let Sainz through as well? Brutal words from Hamilton to his engineer after being forced to let Leclerc pass. Stay until the end to see Hamilton's unexpected reaction. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. It was never meant to end like that. Not under the blazing Miami sun, not in front of the screaming crowds and the flashing lights of the grandstands wrapped in palm trees and ego, not with the sound of silence coming from the Ferrari radio. This was supposed to be a coronation. A spectacle. A strategic masterpiece. The beginning of something historic. For months, the narrative had built toward this very moment. The merging of two generations of elite drivers. Two minds so radically different in approach and experience yet expected to operate as one unit under the banner of Scuderia Ferrari. Charles Leclerc, the golden child of the team's future, cold-blooded in qualifying and surgically aggressive on Sundays. And Lewis Hamilton, the seven-time world champion with the weight of 1,000 races in his memory, a man who had defied eras, rewritten records, and still walked into every circuit like a warrior entering a familiar battlefield. The expectations were astronomical, and yet so was the potential. Ferrari, more than any other team, knows the power of image. They understand the theater. In Miami, where the grid is more Hollywood than motorsport, where million-dollar watches gleam under the Florida sun and celebrities lounge trackside as if Monaco had been transplanted to the American coast, the red team wanted to be the star. Everything had been orchestrated, the guest list, the social media teases, the carefully edited behind-the-scenes footage hinting at chemistry and harmony. But what no camera caught, at least not until it was too late, was the fragility beneath it all. The unspoken tension. The uneasy alliance that had been held together not by genuine trust, but by necessity. And once the pressure was turned up, even just slightly, that bond shattered. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. Lap 28 wasn't when the drama started. It was just when the rest of the world began to see the cracks. Internally, those cracks had been growing all weekend. From the first practice session, Leclerc had expressed discomfort with the car's balance in Sector 2. His engineers had worked overnight, chasing fractions. Hamilton, meanwhile, had been unusually reserved in meetings, watching, listening, analyzing. His data traces had been smoother. His runs longer. He had been managing the weekend like a chess player, never rushing the pieces, never showing the endgame too early. When qualifying came, Charles edged him by a mere tenth. But it had been hard-earned. The sort of lap that required flirting with disaster at every apex. Lewis had settled for P4, knowing the long game would reward him. And the start had been vintage Hamilton. A lightning launch. Clean positioning. He dived into turn 1 like he owned the circuit, slicing ahead of a surprised Red Bull and planting himself firmly in P2, behind the McLaren of Norris who had nailed pole. Leclerc slotted in behind his teammate, the radio chatter already growing restless. For the next 20 laps, Hamilton kept Norris within striking distance, all while preserving his mediums, easing into the ideal pit window. Leclerc, stuck in dirty air, reported rising temps and understeer. Ferrari's pit wall, already split on strategy direction, began debating scenarios. An undercut for Charles? A soft tire gamble for Hamilton? The risk matrix grew more complicated with every lap. Then came the trigger, a virtual safety car on lap 26 after debris was spotted at turn 8. A golden opportunity. Hamilton and Leclerc both pitted, double-stacked, perfectly executed. Hamilton retained track position. Leclerc came out just behind, but now on fresher rubber. On paper, a standard situation. No reason to panic. But inside the Ferrari garage, panic didn't need volume. It spread in glances, in hurried meetings behind screens, in the way engineers began walking with purpose from one monitor to another. Leclerc's lap times began to drop. 0.2 faster. Then 3. Then 5. Leclerc closing, said the pit wall, flatly. The phrasing wasn't accidental. They didn't say Charles is faster. They didn't say prepare for a fight. They said he was closing. As if proximity justified intervention. The telemetry told a nuanced story. Hamilton was still in control, lifting where needed, saving battery, preserving life in the tires. Leclerc was pushing. The delta was more effort than advantage. Subscribe just to stay tuned for the Formula One news no one else explains to you. Then came the call. It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a statement. Lewis, Charles has better pace. Let him through at turn 11. That was it. No further justification. No acknowledgement of the veteran's performance. No tactical breakdown. Just a command, sterile, dismissive, cold. Hamilton didn't protest. Not with words. His radio response was clinical. Understood. But beneath the surface, something far more seismic occurred. He adjusted his brake balance. Changed his differential. Slowed marginally on the straight. Opened the door without theatrics. He did everything by the book. But the fire inside had been lit. Not a loud fire. Not a rage. A quiet, ruthless kindling. The kind that fuels seasons, that shapes destinies. He let Leclerc pass. He followed closely. Too closely. 4-5 laps. The gap never grew past a second. He matched every sector. Pushed through turbulent air. Watched every mistake Charles made. He wasn't racing anymore. He was studying. Back in the garage, the mood shifted. The engineers cheered politely. The cameras panned to the Ferrari pit crew. A few claps, a few nods. But the body language was rigid. Hamilton's performance had never faltered. And yet, he had been sacrificed. Silently. Strategically. And everyone knew it. The remainder of the race was cosmetic. Leclerc caught Norris but couldn't pass. Hamilton stayed close enough to apply pressure, never enough to threaten. The podium was secured, but the celebrations were muted. On the cool-down lap, Charles radioed in, thanks to the team. Good strategy. Lewis said nothing until prompted. Then, finally, car was good. Congrats to the team. Nothing more. Nothing less. But the tone, that sharp glacial tone, said everything. In the post-race press conference, Charles smiled awkwardly, fielding questions about team orders and the pass. He insisted it had been logical. He called Lewis a great teammate. Hamilton, sitting beside him, nodded once, eyes unreadable. When asked if he agreed with the call, his response was ice-cold. I follow instructions. That's my job. No embellishment. No praise. No subtle jab. Just a plain statement from a man who had learned long ago that vengeance in Formula One is not served through words. It's served through results. Back at Maranello, the fallout began before the cars had even returned. Fans were already polarized. Pundits dissected the strategy with surgical precision. Social media erupted in threads about favoritism, internal politics, and the dangerous path Ferrari seemed to be treading. Former drivers weighed in. Some said Ferrari had done what was necessary. Others warned that humiliating a champion, especially one still capable of winning, could have long-term consequences. But the most telling reaction came from within. Sources began whispering about Hamilton's debrief. How he spoke little, how he asked questions instead of voicing opinions. How he stayed long after the others had left, reviewing data, watching onboards. How he left without saying goodbye. Because Lewis Hamilton doesn't react. He responds. He absorbs. He waits. And then, when it matters most, he strikes. Not out of spite, but out of precision. Ferrari may have thought they were managing a team. But what they had forgotten, or chosen to ignore, is that Hamilton isn't just a driver. He's a force. A political figure. A brand. A warrior of discipline. And he never forgets betrayal. Not even when it's disguised as strategy. What moment do you want the thumbnail or title to capture? Because in Formula One, it's never just about the stopwatch. It's never simply about the lap charts, the tire compounds, or the timing screens that flicker with brutal indifference. It's about layers. About things unsaid, things implied. It's about contracts that promise equality but are written in ink that vanishes the moment a preferred son emerges. It's about politics wrapped in telemetry, hierarchy hidden behind strategy calls, and loyalty that only flows one way. This moment, the moment he found himself being asked to move aside, this wasn't strategy. This wasn't about the race. This was a message. A clear, deliberate message, carefully packaged inside a radio command and sent to the very man they once courted like royalty. He had been sold a dream. A vision. Over months of negotiations, over coffees in Monaco, Secret meetings in hotel suites during race weekends, over long calls with managers and advisors and team principals smiling through gritted teeth. They'd painted him a future in red, not as a supporting character, not as a backup, but as a co-leader. A joint force. A driver with a name and history and talent too vast to be sidelined. They told him they needed him. Told him he'd be central to their revival. That the days of favoritism were over. That he was not just wanted, he was needed. He believed them. Not because he was naive, but because he wanted to. He wanted to be part of something historic. He wanted to be the man who brought Ferrari back to glory, not just for them, but for himself. But that afternoon, somewhere between turn 9 and turn 12, as he backed off just enough to let Charles cruise by with clinical efficiency, he realized what had always been true: the structure was already in place. He was not the future. He was the insurance policy. The experienced hand. The one they would praise publicly, but sacrifice when things got tight. And the moment was so surgical, so stripped of emotion, that it almost hurt more than if they'd screamed it. He'd seen the signs earlier in the weekend. In the way his car had felt twitchier despite the same setup. In how the upgrades had arrived, 2 pieces, but only one ready for FP3. In how the data sheets shared after qualifying subtly highlighted Charles's strengths, downplaying his own. In how his strategy options had narrowed overnight, while Charles's had flexibility. At first, he'd chalked it up to the chaos of race weekends. But now, it all crystallized. This wasn't disorganization. This was orchestration. And so, he delayed. Just a little. A few hundred meters longer than they wanted. He wasn't defying them. He was reminding them. Reminding them who he was. Reminding them of everything he had brought to the table. Championships fought. Rivalries endured. Victories claimed in machines far less capable than this red beast. But it didn't matter. The call had been made. Charles was faster, they said. Charles was on the better strategy. Charles needed the air. The same justifications used 1,000 times in the past when one driver was quietly elevated above another. He backed off. Just a breath. Enough for Charles to dart by. There was no radio thanks from the other car. No acknowledgement from the pit wall. Just silence, and then the next message, delivered with the precision of a scalpel. Gap to Sainz behind, 1.2 seconds. That was the real gut punch. Not the overtake. Not the order. But the timing. The reminder, only seconds later, that now there was someone else behind. Another variable. Another potential embarrassment if he didn't keep the pace. As if to say, don't get comfortable. You're already in someone's mirrors. And behind Sainz? Maybe Russell. Or Norris. Or anyone ready to pounce the moment he faltered. The message was clinical, yes. But it was also cruel. And deeply intentional. He could have answered differently. Could have asked why the swap was made. Could have challenged them. Could have demanded clarity. But instead he pressed the button, kept his voice level, and dropped a line that cut deeper than any scream. Should I let him through too? It wasn't sarcasm. It was a test. A trap, almost. A probe to see how far they would go. But there was no answer. Not for 5 seconds. Not for 10. The line stayed open, the silence louder than any engine roar. Because they knew what they had done. And they didn't have the words to justify it. Not to him. In the other car, Charles was flying. He always had been fast in clean air. But now he had something even more powerful: confirmation. The team had made their pick. And with that confirmation came freedom. He was no longer just racing, he was performing. Building the case. Justifying the call. Every sector green, every lap a hammer blow to any debate. He stretched the gap not just on pace, but on narrative. Making it look inevitable. Logical. Mathematical. When in truth, it had been political all along. Inside his own cockpit, the thoughts swirled. He remembered their first briefing together. The team boss had said, "We will always prioritize the team over individuals." But what happens when the team becomes the individual? When the team's identity is so tied to one driver that any threat must be managed, not embraced? What happens when a driver isn't just racing the competition? He's racing the myth the team is trying to create. He still drove. Because that's what he did. Not because he believed in the plan, but because he had to. Because walking away mid-race was never an option. Because this was still his reputation, his brand, his pride. Every overtake, every defended position, every corner taken on the edge was not for points, it was for himself. To remind the world, and maybe even the team, that he wasn't just another number 2. That he was still a giant, even if they had decided to kneel him down. There were fans in the grandstands wearing his cap, waving his flag, chanting his name. They didn't see the politics. They just saw the red blur. But he saw it all. Every time he returned to the garage, the glances were different. The data reviews shorter. The excuses longer. The smiles thinner. They were moving on. Quietly. Strategically. And unless something changed dramatically, he would become just another chapter in their long, messy history. He thought of drivers before him. Ones who had worn the same red and been told the same things. Equal treatment. Shared opportunity. A new era. How many of them left bitter? How many learned, too late, that at Ferrari, legends are sometimes made, but often used? And so the seeds of rebellion took root. Not in the form of revenge, but of resolve. Resolve to no longer wait for fairness. Resolve to race for himself. To strategize for himself. To start thinking not as a team player, but as a survivor. Because now he knew. They'd made their choice. And when a team makes its choice, a driver has to make his. Would you like an even more expanded version, including flashbacks from previous races and a deeper look into his mental preparation? The moment Hamilton stepped out of the car, every eye was on him. Fans, media, mechanics, engineers, rivals. But he didn't acknowledge any of them. The helmet stayed on longer than usual, not for drama, but because he needed the silence. That carbon shell had become the last barrier between himself and a world that, for the second time in a single season, had treated him not as a 7-time world champion, not even as a driver, but as a pawn. He stood there for a moment, the Miami heat radiating off the asphalt, sweat beading beneath his fireproofs, his chest rising and falling at a pace that betrayed none of the rage inside. People around him tried to read him, as if body language could decode betrayal, but there was nothing to interpret. He was unreadable. That was intentional. Park firm protocol began. Cameras rolled. Photographers snapped frames they didn't understand. The team's number 2 car arrived behind him, and the other driver celebrated quietly, as if unsure whether this was a moment to own or to avoid. Hamilton didn't wait. He walked away, past the crew that had once celebrated his every pole, his every win, his every miracle save in the rain. They parted for him now like a tide, not out of respect, but because they didn't know where they stood anymore. No high fives. No hugs. No side glances with knowing smirks. Just tension. Thick, suffocating tension. Inside the garage, monitors still displayed telemetry, but nobody was looking at them. The engineers were waiting. The strategists were whispering among themselves, second-guessing a call that, even as they made it, they knew would detonate the fragile trust holding the team together. On the surface, it was a strategic call, let the other driver through. Justified, they told themselves, by delta times and projected tire degradation and traffic management. But underneath that paper-thin logic, everyone knew the real reason. They were hedging their bets. Planning for a future without him. Trying to shape a new narrative while the old one was still writing its final chapters. And they had done it publicly. In front of millions. Without warning. Without dialogue. Without respect. By the time Lewis reached the back room, the air conditioning was blasting but couldn't cut through the heat clinging to his skin or the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He paced. He didn't sit. He didn't even take off his gloves. The room wasn't empty. A performance engineer tried to initiate post-race debrief protocol, hydration, data dump, standard run-through, but the first look from Hamilton shut it all down. The engineer backed off. The room fell into silence again, this time not out of fear, but out of anticipation. Everyone was waiting for the moment he'd speak. Not because they wanted to hear it, but because they knew it was coming, and once it did, there would be no going back. Then came the voice. Low. Controlled. Cold. Who made that call? No answer. Don't look at each other. I'm asking all of you. Who made that call? Still silence. The strategy chief shifted uncomfortably. The race engineer looked down at his notes. Don't tell me this was for tire life. Don't insult me. I've driven on worse. I've brought the car home on cords. You didn't trust me. That's what this was. Someone muttered something about bigger picture strategy, about team results, about dual objectives. But the words collapsed under the weight of the room's truth. This isn't about strategy, he said, louder now, but still not yelling. This is about narrative. You've decided it's his time. You've decided I've had enough. But here's the part you didn't calculate. I'm still faster. A stunned silence settled in. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't delusion. It was fact. Everyone in that room had seen the delta. They had watched him pull 5/10 in Sector 2 alone. He had been managing pace, nursing tires, holding back, even with the calls coming in that made no sense. He had the race under control until they told him to get out of the way. The senior team member finally spoke. Calmly. Too calmly. Something about mutual respect. About the importance of communication. Respect isn't asking me to move over without context, Lewis snapped. Respect is telling me before the race if this is how it's going to be. Respect is earning my trust, not assuming you still have it. The PR officer knocked softly. It was time for the media. The team principal wasn't in the room. Deliberately absent. Sending a message by not being there. That told Lewis everything. He turned to the strategist again. You've undermined the one constant you had. I've been the variable you could always count on. Through bad cars, through political storms, through rule changes. And now? Now you're gambling on hope instead of certainty. No response. Just shame. The kind that fills a room and turns seasoned professionals into statues. Outside, microphones waited. The press conference stage had already been prepared. Hamilton took a sip of water. Still no helmet off. No gloves removed. Not even a swipe of the sweat from his brow. When he finally walked out into the media zone, the cameras followed every step. He answered no questions. Stared ahead. Gave no sound bites. Gave no headline. And in doing so, he created the biggest one of the weekend. Because silence, when it comes from someone who has spent over a decade turning noise into glory, is louder than anything else. The season wasn't over. Not even close. But the dynamic had changed. The unspoken contract between driver and team, built over years, forged through championships and heartbreaks, had been broken. The paddock felt it. The rivals felt it. Even the fans, watching from thousands of miles away, sensed the shift. Something had changed. Something fundamental. And the rest of the grid? They'd be wise to take note. Because Lewis Hamilton wasn't racing anymore to win for the team. He was racing now to remind them who he is. Would you like this to evolve into a scene from the next race weekend, including how the tension escalates? Meanwhile, in the other room, away from the post-race interviews and the roar of the Miami crowd still echoing in the distance, Charles Leclerc sat alone for a moment, helmet already off, gloves discarded, his face blank yet unreadable. There was no celebration, no overt joy, no raised fists or chest-pounding bravado. But also, crucially, no apology. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't checking screens. He wasn't exchanging words with engineers or glancing toward the corridor where Lewis Hamilton was presumably being debriefed. He was still in that specific way that only drivers can be after a storm. Focused. Not cold. Not arrogant. Just certain. Certain that the decision he had pushed for, the position he had asked for, the response he had received, it had all been justified. In his mind, there had been no injustice. No controversy. No betrayal of values. Just a situation that required clarity, and a moment in which he had felt faster, more efficient, more capable of extracting the performance needed. So he asked for the switch. The team responded. He executed. End of story, as far as he was concerned. But that wasn't the story outside those walls. Outside, among the thousands in the grandstands, and the millions watching from home, the events weren't seen through the lens of strategy or timing deltas. They were viewed as a clash. A breach. A moment where Ferrari's promise of harmony between two of the sport's most compelling drivers had been tested, and had cracked. People didn't just watch the race. They dissected it, frame by frame, moment by moment, trying to decode the implications. What had been said? What hadn't? The way Leclerc's tone shifted in the radio call. The pause before the team gave Hamilton the order. The gap between cars before and after the swap. Everything became data for the court of public opinion, and the verdict wasn't unanimous, but it was heated. Because the tension wasn't just manufactured drama. It was visible, tangible, palpable. You could see it in the way Leclerc avoided eye contact in the cool-down room. In the way Hamilton didn't even bother glancing sideways. The body language wasn't just awkward, it was deliberate. Deliberately distant. Charles settled into the chair on the left as if he were claiming his seat at a poker table, while Lewis, moving slower than usual, took the one on the far right. A chasm opened between them, one that wasn't measured in centimeters but in pride, principles, and diverging beliefs about what had just unfolded. There was no conversation. No tension-easing chuckle. No subtle acknowledgement of a hard-fought race. Not even the usual exaggerated breath of mutual exhaustion. Just two elite athletes, locked in private worlds, separated by silence and something heavier than disagreement, something approaching rupture. Every camera angle told a different part of the story. From behind, the tension showed in their shoulders. From the front, in their eyes. Charles looked forward, expression calm but guarded. Lewis kept his face neutral but his hands were restless, tapping his knees, tightening his jaw, small movements betraying inner turmoil. It wasn't rage. It was reflection. Rapid, deep, potentially long-lasting reflection. This wasn't over. It wasn't close to over. And anyone watching closely knew it. When they finally emerged to face the media, the contrast couldn't have been more striking. Charles, dressed in red, looked composed, like someone already preparing to turn the page. He spoke first, as expected, giving the party line with finesse. He said he trusted the team's decision. He acknowledged that these choices are always difficult, but necessary in the moment. He emphasized the importance of unity, the long season ahead, the bigger picture. He said he respected Lewis deeply. That what happened was purely circumstantial. That Ferrari always acted with the best interest of the team in mind. It was diplomatic, professional, measured, maybe even honest. But there was something in the cadence of his words, something just beneath the surface, that suggested he believed the situation had been handled correctly because he had been the one to push for it. Because in his view, he had been faster. He had earned it. And then came Lewis. Where Charles's answers had been long, detailed, nuanced, Hamilton's were razor-sharp and minimal. He didn't waste time with platitudes. His sentences were short, controlled, delivered with the same clinical precision that made him a world champion 7 times over. I did my job, he said, each word cutting through the air like a blade. I held my position. I was told to move. That's all I have to say. There were no follow-ups, no digressions, no signs of understanding. He didn't try to downplay the hurt. He didn't try to disguise the frustration. What he did, instead, was far more powerful. He contained it. He held it in, just tightly enough that you could still feel it radiating from him. That restraint was telling. Because when Hamilton feels wronged, he doesn't explode in the moment. He collects, stores, transforms frustration into fuel. That was what made this moment so dangerous, not just for Ferrari, but for the balance of the entire project. Because Hamilton hadn't come to Ferrari just to compete. He hadn't joined the team in the twilight of his career for routine podiums or PR campaigns. He had been promised a revolution. A team built around his leadership, his vision, his pursuit of an 8th title. What happened in Miami didn't just challenge that vision, it undermined it. And that's where things get delicate. Because when a driver of Hamilton's caliber feels undermined, the consequences rarely stay internal. They echo. They escalate. They shape the future. Now the entire F1 circus turns its gaze to Imola, a track draped in emotion, history, and tifosi passion. Ferrari's home race. The banners will flood the hills. The chants will rise like ancient hymns. The emotion will be overwhelming. But inside the red garage, things will be anything but romantic. Because now, Ferrari has to manage more than just race pace. They have to manage ideology. Identity. A subtle civil war between two drivers with entirely different visions for the future. Charles believes this is still his team, built with him from the ground up. The long-term project he's bled for, waited for, defended through chaos. Lewis, meanwhile, was brought in to win now. Not to mentor. Not to play wingman. But to take Ferrari to the top, immediately. And when those expectations clash, as they did in Miami, the collateral damage doesn't just show up in split times. It shows up in chemistry. In morale. In every tiny detail of decision-making that separates champions from also-rans. Ferrari's engineers are already caught in the crossfire. Strategy meetings will be quieter. Tense. Every sentence will be measured, every radio call weighed for unintended implications. PR officials will coach answers, preparing for the inevitable barrage of questions from press and fans. The leadership, Vasseur, Elkann, the entire upper hierarchy, will be scrutinized for favoritism, weakness, inconsistency. One wrong move, one poorly worded directive, and the whole facade could shatter. Because this is no longer just about racing. It's about narrative control. Internal politics. The psychological battlefield that underpins a Formula One season. What happened in Miami wasn't a victory. It was a warning shot. Ferrari gained a position, yes. They added a handful of points to their constructor tally. But they may have triggered something far more destabilizing, the beginning of a power struggle. One that could split the team down the middle if not managed with extreme precision. One that could either galvanize Ferrari into a united force, or fracture it beyond repair. And if you think this is all speculation, just watch what happens next. Because whatever Imola brings, rain, chaos, podiums, heartbreak, it will bring it with pressure. With intensity. With the weight of every decision made in Miami still hanging over every corner, every overtake, every race start. And for the two drivers now orbiting opposite ends of the same dream, the next chapter is already being written, not just on the track, but in the hearts and minds of every person wearing red. The fuse has been lit. The countdown has begun. And what comes next might not just define a season, it might define a legacy.